Our reading this morning is from this fascinating new book by Edward O. Wilson. You've probably heard of Edward O. Wilson. He's, among other things, the world's greatest authority on ants. But he founded the field of sociobiology back in the 70s, and he's been refining it ever since. Here he turns his considerable intelligence on humans, the meaning of human existence. Nice, humble title. And he goes through the prehistory of the human species before Homo sapiens, the Homo habilis and Homo erectus and things. And he's recounting it, he comes to this quote. Probably at this point during the Habiline period, Homo habilis was one of the predecessors, a conflict ensued between individual level selection with individuals competing with other individuals in the same group on the one side, and group level selection with competition among groups on the other. The latter force promoted altruism and cooperation among all the group members. It led to innate group-wide morality and a sense of conscience and honor. The competition between the two forces can be expressed succinctly as follows. Within groups, selfish individuals beat altruistic individuals, but groups of altruists beat groups of selfish individuals. Risking oversimplification, individual selection promoted sin, while group selection promoted virtue. So it came to pass that humans are forever conflicted by their prehistory of multi-level selection. They're suspended in unstable and constantly changing positions between the two forces that created us. We are unlikely to yield completely to either force as the ideal solution to our social and political turmoil. To give in completely to the instinctual urgings born from individual selection would be to dissolve society. At the opposite extreme, to surrender to the urgings from group selection would turn us into angelic robots, the outsized equivalent of ants. The eternal conflict is not God's test of humanity. It is not a machination of Satan. It is just the way things worked out. The conflict might be the only way in the entire universe that human-level intelligence and social organization can evolve. We will find a way eventually to live with our inborn turmoil and perhaps find pleasure in viewing it as the primary source of our creativity. Here ends the reading. Natural morality. My son Luke is 40 now, a proud husband and father-to-be with a good job and the markings of respectability. At the beginning of his life, he had a 4-year career as an only child. He was the apple of his parents' eyes, but then he had to yield center stage to a little sister. A few months after Sally was born, our angelic golden-haired son was sitting at his little table in the kitchen when he looked up at his mother and said, "Mom, when Sally dies, can we bury her in the backyard and burn her grave?" Now, he wasn't really trying to kill his infant sister, but he was pretty clearly wishing her dead. And yet he is today the most loving big brother any 30-something could wish for. At some point, his moral judgment matured, and he realized that no matter how his sister had broken his monopoly on parental attention, he couldn't wish her dead. Where does morality come from? One traditional answer is that it comes from God. God made us with the capacity to know right from wrong. This then leads to the obvious question, if God creates us with the knowledge of right and wrong, why doesn't God create us with the will to do right all the time? Down through the ages, we have driven ourselves crazy with questions like this, which go under the technical name theodicy. But many of us in this room are not theists. Some will wear the label atheist, some agnostic, some humanist, some religious naturalist. For many, the word God serves only to confuse and confound. And I had originally planned to preach this sermon on February 15th, close to Darwin's birthday, when we try to look at things from a naturalistic perspective. So let's take God out of the equation this morning. If we assume there is no God, what accounts for our moral sense? You will notice that in putting it this way, I've expanded the question. In theodicy, we're asking why there is evil, assuming that God created and rules everything and that God is good. When we shift to a naturalistic frame of reference, we have to go back a step and ask why humans recognize good and evil at all, why we even have concepts of good and evil, as well as why people do good and evil. And I use the word natural, but a word needs to be said about nature. The word nature has many senses. We may think of it as Emerson did, that part of the world which was not made by human hands. Nature is what's out there. But the word also means essence, a meaning which is in much disfavor among the postmodernists who don't think there are essences of anything. In particular, the attempt to say that there is such a thing as human nature, and then to say what that nature is, encounters several conceptual problems. Theories of universals in human life have often been used to justify our culture or way of life as superior to others. Here's the universal way humans are, and if you don't measure up, there's something wrong with you. Our first principle urges us to accept the diversity of the human race. A closely related objection is the school of thought that says the human mind is a blank slate. We're born without any innate tendencies. In the 1960s, this was the liberal position. If we were going to try to fulfill this nation's promise of equality, to make good on this dishonored check that Martin Luther King referred to in 1963, the liberal solution was more money for education, particularly early childhood education, and the hope that this would cancel out poor home environments and poverty. In other ages, the blank slate idea was endorsed by totalitarian regimes like the Soviets and the Nazis to attempt to mold a new type of personality by controlling child rearing and education. Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker, who you know is a favorite of mine, wrote a book about 10 years ago called The Blank Slate, in which he argued forcefully against this idea and showed in some detail that psychology and neurology and sociology and anthropology are proving that the human mind at birth is not a blank slate, that there is a set of definite features which most people are born with, and this includes a basic sense of morality. Well, these caveats lead us to sharpen the question. Where does moral sense come from? Is it something we each have to learn, or are we born with it? Is every human's moral sense the same, or is it dependent on culture and class and the circumstances of birth and upbringing? And beyond these questions of humans and morality, there's the question of whether morality exists out in the world, or is it confined to human affairs? Many writers on the subject of evil think that the word evil covers not only murders and war and invasions, but also plagues, earthquakes, and tsunamis, so-called natural evils. Is the coyote stealing your pet cat from your rear deck doing an evil act? Most of us would say not, and confine the word evil to actions taken by humans. Now, if we've abandoned the idea of God creating humans for purposes of this discussion, we're left with evolution as the main engine, making us who we are. We can examine this evolutionary endowment by archaeology and collecting what we know about Paleolithic sites, but we might also start with the present, with brand new human beings before they have a chance to be corrupted by a lot of learning and culture. Consider this, quote, "The 1-year-old decided to take justice into his own hands. He had just watched a puppet show with 3 characters. The puppet in the middle rolled the ball to the puppet on the right, who passed it right back to him. It then rolled the ball to the puppet on the left, who ran away with it. At the end of the show, the nice puppet and the naughty puppet were brought down from the stage and set before the boy. A treat was placed in front of each of them, and the boy was invited to take one of the treats away. As predicted, and like most of the toddlers in this experiment, he took it from the naughty one, the one who had run away with the ball. But this wasn't enough. The boy then leaned over and smacked the puppet on the head. This, as you can tell, is not a myth or a folk tale, but a scientific experiment. It is reported in this book, Just Babies, The Origins of Good and Evil, by Yale psychologist Paul Bloom. Bloom is a specialist in infant psychology, and his book summarizes what we know about the development of morals in children. Do babies have morals? Yes, said Bloom, in a way. Experiments like the one I just recounted show that, quote, some aspects of morality come naturally to us and others do not. We have a moral sense that enables us to judge others and that guides our compassion and condemnation. We are naturally kind to others, at least some of the time, but we possess ugly instincts as well, and these can metastasize into evil. This moral sense found in babies is not the same as an impulse to do good and avoid doing evil. Rather, it is the capacity to make certain types of judgments, to distinguish between good and bad, between kindness and cruelty, unquote. Thus, the 1-year-old baby in the experiment I just talked about probably cannot speak, has no words to express right and wrong, may have a primitive notion of himself as distinguished from the world, and may be quite selfish when it comes to sharing toys and treats, but he is able to make a moral judgment about which puppet was naughty and which was nice based on observing the carefully scripted scenario that the experimenter had set up. Quote, babies are sensitive to the good and bad acts of others long before they are capable of doing anything good or bad themselves. It seems likely then that the moral sense is first extended to others, and then at some later point in development turns inward. At this point, children come to see themselves as moral agents, and this recognition manifests itself through guilt, shame, or pride, unquote. In the different chapters of the book, Bloom discusses the components of a moral sense, using experiments on infants, but also straying into adult psychology, philosophy, and ethics. In the chapter on empathy and compassion, he discusses mirror neurons, those cells in the brain which light up when you're experiencing something and also light up when you see someone else experiencing a similar thing. The claims about mirror neurons, Bloom says, are overblown, but it's undeniable that our brains are wired to have a capacity for empathy, to allow us to put ourselves in the other person's shoes. But this is a nuanced faculty. Empathy can be automatic and unconscious. A crying person can affect your mood even if you try to tune him or her out. But in many instances, we can choose to empathize or not. Also, empathy is influenced by what one thinks of the other person. In one adult study, this is one of my favorites, the male subjects had a money transaction with a stranger in which they were either rewarded or double-crossed. They then watched that stranger get a mild electrical shock while some sort of device registered their brain activity. Quote, if the stranger who was nice got shocked, the participants showed a neural response consistent with empathy. Indeed, the same part of the brain lit up at the sight as when they themselves got shocked. But when the stranger who was nasty got shocked, there was no empathy. Parts of the brain associated with reward and pleasure lit up instead. End quote. Behaviors observed in infants which point toward compassion are soothing, helping, and sharing. Toddlers will attempt to pat a crying fellow toddler and pat him. They will also have been shown to spontaneously help an adult trying to pick up an object out of reach or open a door with their arms full. And children begin to spontaneously share in the second half of their first year, and the degree of sharing shoots up in the year that follows. Children develop a sense of fairness early. One study was of 10-month-old and 16-month-old infants. The infants watched the following puppet show. A bear and a lion each distributed 2 multicolored discs to a donkey and a cow. The lion gave each animal 1 disc, but the bear gave both discs to one animal and gave the other animal nothing. The children were then shown the lion and the bear and asked, which is the good one? The 10-month-old chose randomly, but the 16-month-olds preferred the one who divided fairly. I find this fascinating. Data points on how our sense of justice is introduced into the mind. A little later in the book, Bloom gets into retribution and punishment. He distinguishes private revenge from public punishment and cites Steven Pinker's study that I have preached on several times. The more the state or Leviathan takes over the function of punishment, the less violent the society will be. Children have impulses to vengeance, and some can be highly aggressive. As you measure the rate of physical violence through the lifespan, says Bloom, it peaks at about age 2. But children's desire for vengeance can also be expressed in a more subtle way, by tattling. Quote, in one study, 2- and 3-year-olds were taught a new game to play with a puppet. When the puppet started to break the rules, the children would spontaneously complain to the adults. Unquote. Nobody has to tell a 2- or 3-year-old how to rat out a playmate. Here's a chapter called Others, which discusses group loyalty. He cites the story of the Good Samaritan, in which Jesus tells us that the neighbor we are commanded to love might be the one from the much despised other tribe. After a discussion of racism, concern, and indifference, he circles back to the Good Samaritan with the observation, quote, nobody knows whether a truly universalist ethic is humanly possible, whether we can be indifferent to ties of culture, country, or blood, and still be good and decent people, unquote. There's a little sentence that ought to concern us quite a bit. One of the most compelling factors dividing us from them is language. And one of the most fascinating tidbits of research on language loyalty is the following. Quote, young babies can recognize the language that they have been exposed to, and they prefer it to other languages even if spoken by a stranger. Experiments that use methodologies in which babies suck on a pacifier to indicate their preferences find that Russian babies prefer to hear Russian, French babies prefer French, American babies prefer English, and so on. This effect shows up mere minutes after birth, suggesting that babies were becoming familiar with those muffled sounds that they heard in the womb. I don't know what floors me more about that. The thought that babies have a language preference at birth, or that experimenters can actually find this out, any psychological fact about newborns. There are more wonders in this book than we have time for today, but let me try to sum up. Bloom is not saying that what we can measure in babies is the sum total of morality. He distinguishes between the basic moral faculties, which he finds present in babies, and what he calls higher moral faculties, which come from reason and experience. Babies are not going to organize a protest march against economic inequality or the Pilgrim nuclear plant. And there may be rough and universal agreement in the early years of life about what things are good and what things are bad, but that agreement obviously breaks down on certain issues as we get older. The last chapter in the book is a summing up chapter called How to Be Good. And in it, Bloom discusses this idea of higher moral faculties. a phrase used by Alfred Russel Wallace. I want to say a little word about Wallace. He deserves more recognition, for he was the co-discoverer with Darwin of natural selection back in 1859. Darwin just beat him to publication. But he remained a theist, Wallace did, and in 1869 he offered the opinion that the, quote, higher moral faculties were instilled in the human species by God. Bloom takes on this idea, which has been echoed in recent times by biologist Francis Collins and conservative there's a Freudian slip, conservative pundit Dinesh D'Souza. Bloom says that these are all claiming that at some point in our evolution, God must have restructured the human brain because there's more in the way of moral structures there than evolution can account for. But they're wrong, says Bloom. Quote, the mere existence of altruistic motivations that serve no reproductive purpose, even those that motivate choices that are bad for us and bad for our genes, that's when we risk our lives to save strangers, is fully consistent with biological evolution. After all, natural selection is not clairvoyant. It responds to current contingencies, not to anticipated future environments. So maladaptive behavior in the here and now is fully consistent with evolutionary theory. Unquote. While the basic reflexes of the infants are part of the evolutionary heritage of the species, the higher moral faculties are not part of human nature. Quote, insights such as the wrongness of slavery could hardly be innate if they weren't appreciated by people hundreds of years ago. And even certain aspects of morality that are assumed by many to be part of our innate endowment, such as kindness toward strangers, actually turn out to be lacking in babies and young children, unquote. So these theistic critics, says Bloom, quote, are like men marveling at eyeglasses and arguing that since natural selection couldn't have created such intricate wonders, they must be the handiwork of God. They're forgetting the third option. We made them. Similarly, our enhanced morality is the product of human interaction and human ingenuity. We create the environments that can transform an only partially moral baby into a very moral adult, unquote. Of course, the devil is in the details of how such environments can work, but we are all interested in making those partially moral babies into fully moral adults. So where are we? We started out to look at where the moral sense comes from if we take God out of the picture. We rely on Darwinian processes, particularly natural selection. But recall the reading I did from E.O. Wilson earlier. Natural selection works on two levels, and they point in different directions morally. Selection at the individual level favors greed and selfishness, where selection at the group level favors altruism and cooperation. Thus, there are at the outset two forces operating to shape human nature. And Bloom holds that the evolutionary basics are not all of morality, but are the foundations on which a full morality may be built. I think this idea of Wilson's is brilliant. It's giving you a thoroughly naturalistic account of good and evil as interwoven in the very human condition itself. Now look at the illustration on your order of service. Some of you may see only a series of funny shapes, but if you look closely enough at this print by M.C. Escher, you will see that the bat-like devil creatures alternate with the white angel figures, and together they occupy the whole universe. The human cosmos, the universe of our lives, is filled with good and evil influences. As Wilson says, the eternal conflict between these two levels of natural selection is not God's test of humanity. It is not imagination of Satan. It is just the way things worked out. Unquote. Amen. Blessed be